March 15, 2017, Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Frank Kellerman had interviewed over 3,000 guests in his 15-year career. None of them had ever pulled a knife on live television. Vincent Torres, a whistleblower scheduled to discuss government contracts, walked onto the set carrying more than just documents. Security footage later showed him slipping the blade from his jacket at 11:47 p.m., exactly 3 minutes into the interview. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 37 seconds was broadcast to 2.3 million viewers. The network called it a psychotic break. The police called it attempted assault. The media called it the end of Frank Kellerman's career. But 7 years later, someone called it something else entirely. The night Vincent Torres tried to save Frank Kellerman's life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's hands trembled as he adjusted the fading KQED bumper sticker on his coffee mug, the same ritual he'd performed every morning for 7 years in the cramped radio booth that had become his world. Cedar Falls, Iowa was 3 states and a lifetime away from Studio 6B. But Vincent Torres still visited him here, in the dead air between commercial breaks, in the flutter of papers that sounded too much like struggle. The morning show prep felt heavier today. March 15th always did. 7 years to the day since everything collapsed, since the cameras stopped rolling and the real nightmare began. Frank pulled up the weather report, scanned the local obituaries, anything to keep his mind occupied until the red on-air light flickered to life. Good morning, Cedar Falls. It's Frank Kellerman with you on this Tuesday, and if you're just joining us, we're talking about the City Council's proposal for the new community center. His radio voice was different now, smaller, careful, stripped of the easy confidence that had once commanded late-night audiences. Let's go to Jenny on line 2. The caller's voice crackled through his headphones. Frank, I just think it's terrible how they're planning to tear down the old Miller property. Some of us remember when that family built this town. Frank nodded into the microphone, offering the expected sympathy, the local concern that had replaced celebrity interviews and network pressure. This was safer, predictable. No one in Cedar Falls cared that he'd once sat across from movie stars and politicians. Here, he was just another transplant who'd bought the struggling AM station and kept it running on farm reports and high school football. The call wrapped, and Frank glanced through the booth window at his daughter Emma, 17 and brilliant, hunched over her chemistry homework at the reception desk. She'd been 10 when they'd fled New York, young enough to adapt, old enough to remember fragments of their old life. She never asked why they'd left, never questioned why her father had traded network television for a radio station that barely broke even. Next up, we've got traffic and weather together, but first, Frank's finger hovered over the next caller button. Line 3 had been blinking for the past 10 minutes, patient and persistent. Let's go to line 3, you're on with Frank. Static filled his headphones. Then a voice, low and deliberate. Male, unfamiliar. Hello, Frank. I've been waiting a long time to talk to you. Something in the caller's tone made Frank's chest tighten. What's on your mind this morning? Vincent Torres. The name hit Frank like a physical blow. His hand instinctively moved toward the dump button, muscle memory from years of live television, but he hesitated. In 7 years, no one had mentioned that name on his show. No one in Cedar Falls knew. I'm sorry, caller, but I think you've got the wrong... I've got the footage, Frank. The real footage. Camera 4, the angle they never aired. The voice remained calm, conversational, as if discussing the weather. 47 seconds of Vincent Torres trying to save your life, not take it. Frank's vision blurred. Through the booth window, Emma looked up from her textbook, concern creasing her face as she watched her father's expression. He forced his voice to remain steady, professional. I'm not sure what you're referring to, caller. Perhaps we should... The knife wasn't for you, Frank. It was for them, the people watching from the shadows. Vincent knew they were there. He was trying to warn you, trying to protect you from what was coming next. The caller paused, and Frank could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of a highway. Sarah Martinez died because you didn't listen. The name of his former assistant, the young woman who died in a car accident 3 days after the Torres incident, made Frank's hand slam down on the dump button. Dead air filled the booth for 8 seconds before he managed to speak. We're going to take a quick commercial break, folks. Be right back with more of your calls and concerns here on KQED. Frank stabbed the commercial button with shaking fingers, grateful for the automated voice selling farm insurance. His daughter was already moving toward the booth door, but Frank held up a hand, needing a moment to process what had just happened. The phone console showed line 3 had disconnected, but line 4 was now blinking. Then line 5. By the time Frank looked up, all 6 lines were lit, holding, waiting. The caller display showed the same number on each line. Impossible, but there it was. His cell phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the Riverside Diner, Highway 63. 1 hour. Come alone or everyone in Cedar Falls learns about the cover-up. Emma knocked on the booth door. Dad? The phones are going crazy and you look like you've seen a ghost. Frank stared at his daughter's worried face through the glass, then at the blinking phone lines, then at the message that threatened to destroy the only life he had left. Don't let this story slip away. Subscribe now because tomorrow's revelation will change everything you thought you knew about Frank's escape to Cedar Falls. Frank switched off the booth's main power, plunging the phone console into darkness. The sudden silence felt like diving underwater, muffled, disorienting, but temporarily safe. Through the thick glass, Emma's eyes widened with concern, her chemistry textbook forgotten as she pressed her palm against the door. Technical difficulties, Frank mouthed, forcing what he hoped looked like a reassuring smile. Give me 5 minutes. She nodded but didn't move away from the window, her dark eyes, so much like her mother's, scanning his face for clues. At 17, Emma had inherited more than Rachel's eyes. She had her mother's ability to read people, to sense when the adults in her life were drowning in secrets. It was a skill that had served her well during their early years in Cedar Falls, when Frank would wake screaming from nightmares he couldn't explain. Frank pulled out his cell phone and stared at the message again. The Riverside Diner sat on the outskirts of town, a chrome and vinyl relic that served coffee strong enough to strip paint and pie that reminded him why they'd stayed in Iowa. He and Emma ate there every Sunday after her softball games, claiming the same corner booth where she'd share gossip about her teammates and he'd pretend to listen while actually marveling at how normal their life had become. 7 years. 7 years of Friday night football games, parent-teacher conferences, and helping Emma with her college applications. She'd been accepted to Northwestern for early admission, full scholarship, planning to study journalism. A career choice that made Frank's stomach clench with pride and terror in equal measure. Their quiet life in Cedar Falls had given her the confidence to chase the very world he'd fled from. The booth smelled like old electronics and the vanilla air freshener Emma had given him last Christmas. A small gesture that had made him cry when she wasn't looking. These walls had become his confessional, the place where he'd slowly learned to speak without the calculated charm that had once made him famous. Here, he was just Frank Kellerman, the guy who knew everyone's name at the hardware store and never missed a city council meeting. Through the window, he watched Emma organize the caller log sheets with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. She worked at the station every day after school, answering phones and managing the community bulletin board with the seriousness of someone preparing for bigger things. The Northwestern acceptance letter was pinned to the corkboard above her desk, a reminder that in 5 months she'd leave Cedar Falls and him behind. Frank's hand drifted to the framed photo on his desk. Emma at last year's county fair, cotton candy in one hand, a journalism award in the other, grinning with the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never had to reinvent herself. She didn't remember the paparazzi outside their New York apartment, the reporters shouting questions about Vincent Torres while 10-year-old Emma hid behind his legs. She remembered only the road trip west, the adventure of choosing a new home, the excitement of helping him fix up the radio station. The cell phone buzzed again. Another message. 43 minutes now. The longer you wait, the more people get hurt. Frank's throat tightened. In his previous life, threats had been abstract things. Disgruntled viewers, celebrity stalkers, network politics. Here, threats meant Emma working late at the station alone, walking to her car after dark, trusting the small-town safety that Frank had carefully constructed around them. Cedar Falls had felt like a sanctuary because no one here knew about Vincent Torres, about the knife, about the way the cameras had kept rolling while a man's life and Frank's career bled out in real time. Emma tapped on the glass again, pointing at the clock. The commercial break was almost over. Frank nodded and reached for the power switch, then stopped. If he turned the phones back on, if he finished the show as if nothing had happened, he'd be living a lie. But if he didn't, if he acknowledged that his past had finally found them, everything would change. The morning sun slanted through the station's front windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny satellites around Emma's head as she waited for his signal. This was his favorite time of day. The quiet hour when Cedar Falls was waking up, when the world felt small and manageable, when he could pretend that Frank Kellerman, the radio host, was the only Frank Kellerman who had ever existed. 39 minutes until the meeting at Riverside Diner. Frank flipped the power switch. The phone console blazed to life, all 6 lines still blinking with impossible persistence. He took a breath, looked at his daughter one more time, and reached for the microphone that connected him to the only audience that mattered now. "We're back, Cedar Falls. Sorry about that technical glitch. Now, where were we?" But even as he spoke, Frank was calculating distances, exit strategies, and how to keep Emma safe when their carefully constructed world finally collapsed. Frank managed to get through the next 20 minutes on autopilot, fielding calls about the community center with the same measured attention he'd perfected over 7 years of hiding in plain sight. But his eyes kept drifting to the phone console, where the 6 lines had finally gone dark, leaving only the ghost of that impossible caller's voice echoing in his headphones. When the show ended, Frank walked into the main office where Emma was updating the community calendar, her pen moving across the schedule with the same careful precision she applied to everything. Tuesday, Rotary Club meeting. Thursday, high school drama club auditions. Saturday, Emma's last home softball game before graduation. The normalcy of it made Frank's chest ache. "Dad, what happened in there?" Emma didn't look up from her writing, but Frank caught the tension in her shoulders. "You looked like someone had told you the world was ending." Frank forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to him. "Just a weird caller. You know how it is. Full moon brings out the conspiracy theorists." Now she did look up, her dark eyes studying his face with that unnerving intensity she'd inherited from her mother. "It's not a full moon, Dad, and you've been jumpy all morning, ever since you saw that date on the calendar, March 15th. Of course she'd noticed. Emma noticed everything, filed it away in that sharp mind that would take her far from Cedar Falls and into a world Frank prayed would be kinder to her than it had been to him. "I'm fine, Em. Really." Frank grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, his movements too quick, too deliberate. "Listen, I need to run an errand. Can you handle the afternoon programming?" "Since when do you run errands during business hours?" Emma set down her pen and crossed her arms. "Dad, you haven't left the station during the day in... God, I can't even remember when. What's going on?" Frank's phone buzzed. "Another message, 22 minutes. Don't make me come to you." The words sent ice through Frank's veins. The thought of this caller, whoever he was, walking into the station, bringing the past into Emma's space was unbearable. Frank had spent 7 years building walls around their life, creating a bubble where Emma could grow up safe from the wreckage of Vincent Torres and everything that had followed. "It's nothing you need to worry about," Frank said, knowing even as the words left his mouth that they sounded exactly like the kind of lie he'd promised never to tell her. "I'll be back in an hour." Emma stood up, and for a moment Frank saw not his 17-year-old daughter, but the woman she was becoming, intelligent, determined, unwilling to accept easy answers. "Dad, you're scaring me. What kind of errand requires you to look like you're about to throw up?" Frank paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Through the window, he could see Main Street stretching toward the highway, toward the diner where someone waited with footage that could destroy everything. For 7 years, he'd convinced himself that the past was buried, that Vincent Torres and Sarah Martinez and the cover-up that had driven him from New York were ancient history. But the past, Frank was learning, never stayed buried. "Em, I need you to promise me something." Frank turned back to face his daughter, memorizing her face in case this was one of the last normal moments they'd ever share. "If anything happens, if anyone comes around asking questions about me, about our life before Cedar Falls, I need you to call Sheriff Morrison immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." Emma's face went pale. "Dad, you're really freaking me out." What kind of questions? What happened before Cedar Falls? Frank's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a text. It was a photo. The image was grainy, clearly taken from a distance, but unmistakably recent. Emma walking out of the high school, her backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware that someone was watching her. The caption beneath the photo read, 18 minutes. She's beautiful, Frank. It would be a shame if Cedar Falls found out their local radio hero was really a man who let a woman die to protect his career. Frank's hands shook as he stared at the image. The caller wasn't just threatening to expose him, he was threatening Emma. The sanctuary Frank had built around their life was already compromised, invaded by someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure. I have to go, Frank said, his voice barely steady. Lock the station doors after I leave. Don't let anyone in except Sheriff Morrison or Doc Peterson, okay? Dad! Promise me, Em. Emma nodded, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Frank kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, and walked out into the Iowa morning that suddenly felt like the beginning of an ending. As he climbed into his truck, Frank caught sight of Emma watching him through the station window, her hand pressed against the glass like she was already saying goodbye. 15 minutes to the diner. 15 minutes until his carefully constructed exile crumbled completely. The drive to Riverside Diner should have taken 12 minutes. Frank stretched it to 17, taking every back road he could remember, checking his mirrors for cars that might be following. But Cedar Falls was a small town on a Tuesday morning. The only traffic was Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick creeping toward the grocery store and Danny Walsh's pickup hauling feed to his farm. Frank's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He'd faced hostile interviews, network executives, and tabloid reporters, but this felt different. Those battles had been fought in familiar territory, with rules he understood. This was his sanctuary being invaded, his daughter being threatened, his carefully constructed life being dismantled by someone who knew exactly which buttons to push. The Riverside Diner sat alone on Highway 63, surrounded by cornfields that stretched toward the horizon. Frank had eaten Sunday breakfast there with Emma just 4 days ago, listening to her excitement about Northwestern's journalism program, while trying not to think about how empty the station would feel without her laughter echoing through the halls. Now the diner's chrome exterior looked ominous under the gray March sky, like a trap waiting to spring. Frank parked next to a black sedan with Illinois plates, the only other car in the lot. Through the diner's front window, he could see a figure in the corner booth, back to the wall, face obscured by shadows. Everything about the scene felt choreographed, deliberate, like a stage set designed to make Frank feel exposed. He sat in his truck for another minute, engine running, cell phone in his hand. He could call Sheriff Morrison, but what would he say? That someone knew about his past? That wouldn't be enough to bring Tom Morrison running, and besides, Frank wasn't ready to explain Vincent Torres to anyone in Cedar Falls, not even the sheriff who'd become something close to a friend over the past 7 years. Frank's phone buzzed with a final message. I can see you sitting there. Come inside or I start making calls to the Cedar Falls Gazette, the local paper. Frank's stomach clenched as he imagined the headlines, the questions, the way people would look at Emma once they knew her father had been involved in something that ended with a dead woman and a career in ruins. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everyone's business became everyone else's entertainment, and Emma would bear the weight of that scrutiny long after Frank was gone. He turned off the engine and walked toward the diner, gravel crunching under his feet like broken glass. The bell above the door chimed his entrance, a sound that had always seemed welcoming before, but now felt like an alarm announcing his surrender. The man in the corner booth was younger than Frank had expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested too much time indoors. He wore a gray suit that looked expensive but rumpled, as if he'd been traveling for days. A laptop sat open on the table beside an untouched cup of coffee, and when he looked up at Frank's approach, his eyes held the flat, predatory gleam of someone who'd spent years hunting. Frank Kellerman. The man gestured to the opposite side of the booth. Please, sit. We have a lot to discuss. Frank remained standing, scanning the diner. Marge Crawford worked the morning shift, but she was nowhere to be seen, probably in the kitchen, giving them the privacy that small-town politeness demanded. The only sound was the hum of the coffee maker and the distant rumble of a truck on the highway. Who are you? Frank asked. That's not the right question. The man turned his laptop screen toward Frank. The image showed the interior of a television studio, frozen at the moment before everything went wrong. Vincent Torres sat in the guest chair, his face animated with the desperate energy Frank remembered too well. The right question is, what really happened that night 7 years ago? Frank felt his legs weaken. He'd seen the official footage 1,000 times in nightmares, but this angle was different, shot from a camera position he didn't recognize. Vincent Torres wasn't looking at Frank with the wild eyes of a madman. He was looking past Frank, toward something or someone off camera, his expression sharp with fear rather than rage. "I don't know what you think you have," Frank said, sliding into the booth because standing had become impossible. But the Torres incident was investigated. Everything that happened was carefully edited. The man's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone holding all the cards. Sarah Martinez died because she was going to tell the truth about what the cameras didn't show, about who was really in that studio, about why Vincent Torres came armed that night. Frank's chest tightened. Sarah died in a car accident. Did she? The man's smile was cold, empty. Or did she die because she wouldn't take the money like you did? The words hit Frank like a physical blow, confirming what he'd always suspected but never dared to voice, that Sarah's death hadn't been random, that his escape to Cedar Falls had been bought with silence and complicity, and that somewhere in the shadows people had been watching, waiting for the right moment to collect on debts Frank hadn't known he owed. Frank's vision blurred at the edges. The diner seemed to tilt, chrome surfaces reflecting fractured images of a man whose carefully constructed identity was dissolving in real time. "I never took any money," he said, but the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. The stranger leaned back, studying Frank with the patience of a surgeon preparing to make the first incision. "Really? Then what do you call that severance package from the network? The one that came with the house in Cedar Falls, the radio station deed, and enough cash to start over without asking uncomfortable questions?" Frank's mouth went dry. He'd told himself the settlement was standard, compensation for a career ended by circumstances beyond his control. The network executives had been sympathetic, understanding, eager to help him disappear quietly rather than face prolonged litigation. But now, seeing it through this stranger's eyes, Frank realized how naive he'd been, how willfully blind. "They were helping me protect my daughter," Frank whispered. They were protecting themselves. The man clicked to another image on his laptop. This one showed Sarah Martinez in the studio hallway, her face pale but determined, clutching a manila envelope. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., 3 hours after the Torres incident, when Frank had already been whisked away by network security. Sarah stayed behind that night. She went through the footage, Frank, all of it, not just what made it to air. Frank stared at the image, remembering Sarah's intensity, her hunger for truth that had made her the best researcher in the business. She'd been the one who booked Vincent Torres, who'd spent weeks gaining his trust, who'd promised him a platform to tell his story about the pharmaceutical company that had destroyed his family. Frank had barely glanced at her research notes before the show, too focused on maintaining his carefully polished persona to pay attention to the human being sitting across from him. "What did she find?" Frank asked, though part of him already knew the answer would destroy whatever piece he had left. The stranger clicked again. Another angle, this one showing the studio's back entrance. A figure in an expensive suit slipped through the door just as Vincent Torres was pulling out the knife that wasn't supposed to be a weapon but a prop, a piece of evidence Torres had brought to prove his claims about cover-ups and corporate murder. "Recognize him?" the stranger asked. Frank squinted at the screen, and his blood turned to ice. The figure was Martin Blackstone, the pharmaceutical executive Torres had been trying to expose, the man who'd supposedly been across the country that night, who'd provided alibis and sworn statements about his whereabouts. But here he was, in Frank's studio, watching as his accuser's life fell apart on live television. "Blackstone orchestrated the whole thing," the stranger continued, his voice calm as if discussing the weather. Torres wasn't having a breakdown. He was reacting to seeing the man who'd killed his daughter standing in the shadows, protected by network security. That's what Sarah figured out. That's what got her killed. Frank's hands shook as the implications crashed over him. Every nightmare, every sleepless night, every moment he'd blamed himself for not seeing the signs of Torres's instability, it had all been based on a lie. Torres hadn't been unstable. He'd been desperate, betrayed, manipulated into a situation designed to discredit him permanently. The car accident, Frank said slowly. Brake lines cut while she was meeting with a journalist from the Washington Post. Sarah had copies of everything. The real footage, Blackstone's financial records, communications between the network and the pharmaceutical company. She was going to expose all of it. The stranger closed the laptop with a soft click, until her car went off the Queensboro Bridge. Frank thought about Emma, about her journalism scholarship, about the proud way she talked about seeking truth and holding power accountable. His daughter was planning to enter the same profession that had gotten Sarah Martinez killed, and Frank had never warned her, had never told her how dangerous the truth could be when it threatened the wrong people. "Why are you showing me this?" Frank asked. "Sarah's been dead for 7 years. Torres died in prison. What's the point?" "The point," the stranger said, reaching into his jacket, "is that Martin Blackstone is about to be nominated for Secretary of Health and Human Services, and some very powerful people want to make sure his past stays buried forever." He placed a photograph on the table between them. It showed Emma leaving Northwestern University after her campus visit. The same backpack, the same unconscious confidence, but now Frank could see what he'd missed before. A black sedan following at a distance, windows tinted, license plates obscured. "Your daughter wants to be a journalist, Frank. Just like Sarah Martinez, just like the last person who tried to tell this story." The stranger's smile never wavered. "The only question now is whether you're going to help us make sure she doesn't make the same mistake." Frank stared at the photograph of Emma, his mind racing through 7 years of careful isolation, of radio shows and small-town routines, of bedtime stories and homework help, all of it built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath his feet. The stranger sat across from him, radiating the quiet confidence of someone who'd already won, and Frank felt something snap inside his chest like a wire pulled too tight. "You think you have me figured out," Frank said, his voice steadier than he felt. "You think I'm going to roll over because you've threatened my daughter, because you've shown me some footage that proves what I should have known 7 years ago." The stranger's smile widened. "I think you're a man who spent 7 years running from the truth, a man who took blood money and convinced himself it was for his daughter's sake. You're exactly what I expected, Frank. Predictable, cowardly, and completely broken." Frank's hands stilled on the table. Something in the stranger's tone, the casual cruelty of it, triggered a memory that had been buried under years of self-doubt and guilt. Vincent Torres, in those final moments before security tackled him, hadn't been looking at Frank with hatred. He'd been looking at Frank with disappointment, as if Frank had betrayed him by not understanding what was really happening. "You made a mistake," Frank said quietly. "Excuse me? You made a mistake coming here, threatening Emma, showing me those pictures." Frank leaned forward, and for the first time since entering the diner he felt like himself again, not the broken exile hiding in Iowa, but the man who'd once commanded audiences of millions. "Because you don't know me at all." The stranger's confidence flickered for just a moment. "Frank, I don't think you understand your situation." "No, I understand it perfectly. You need me alive and cooperative, or you would have just had Emma's brakes cut like you did Sarah's. You need me to help bury this story, to discredit anyone who tries to investigate Blackstone's nomination. That's why you're here, instead of just eliminating the problem." Frank's voice gained strength with each word. "But here's what you don't understand. I'm not the same man who took their money 7 years ago." Frank pulled out his phone, and the stranger tensed. But instead of dialing, Frank opened his recording app, the same one he used to capture interview clips for the radio station. The red dot indicated it had been running since Frank sat down. "I've been recording this entire conversation," Frank said. "Every word about Sarah Martinez, about Martin Blackstone, about the cover-up. It's already uploaded to a cloud server that Emma accesses for the station's digital content." The stranger's face went white. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" 7 years in small-town radio teaches you to think like a journalist again, to ask questions, to verify sources, to protect your sources. Frank stood up, pocketing the phone. See, I stopped being a television personality the night Vincent Torres died, but I never stopped being a reporter. The stranger reached for his own phone, but Frank was already moving toward the door. You have exactly 1 hour to get out of Cedar Falls before I call Sheriff Morrison and the FBI field office in Des Moines. 1 hour before I send copies of this recording to every major news outlet in the country. Frank, wait. You don't understand what you're doing. These people don't just threaten. They follow through. Ask Sarah Martinez. Frank paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Sarah Martinez died because she was alone, because she tried to fight this by herself, and there was nobody watching her back. He turned to face the stranger one last time. But Emma isn't alone, and unlike you, I actually understand what it means to love someone more than your own life. The bell chimed as Frank walked out into the Iowa morning, his heart pounding but his mind clear for the first time in 7 years. Behind him, he could hear the stranger making frantic phone calls, the careful choreography of intimidation falling apart in real time. Frank climbed into his truck and started the engine, but instead of heading back to the radio station, he drove toward the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Office. As he pulled into the parking lot, his phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Dad, you left your coffee cup on the desk. It says World's Greatest Dad on it. I hope whoever you're meeting knows that's true. Frank smiled, tears blurring his vision. For 7 years, he'd convinced himself that silence was protection, that hiding was love, that the past was a burden Emma should never have to carry. But Emma wasn't Sarah Martinez. She wasn't alone and unprotected. She was Frank Kellerman's daughter, and Frank Kellerman hadn't died in that television studio 7 years ago. He'd just been sleeping. Now it was time to wake up. Frank sat in his truck outside the sheriff's office for 10 minutes, engine running, watching the morning shift change through the glass doors. Deputy Chen waved goodbye to Sheriff Morrison, her patrol car kicking up gravel as she pulled onto Main Street. Tom Morrison stood in the doorway with his coffee, surveying Cedar Falls like a man who genuinely believed he could protect everyone in it. 7 years ago, Frank would have laughed at that kind of small-town idealism. Now it might be the only thing standing between Emma and the people who'd killed Sarah Martinez. Frank's phone buzzed with another message from Emma. Dad, Mrs. Henderson called about tomorrow's community spotlight. Should I reschedule? Tomorrow. As if there would be a tomorrow where Frank Kellerman still hosted afternoon drive time on KCFL, where Emma still helped with the Saturday morning show, where their biggest worry was whether the coffee shop interview would run long. The normalcy of Emma's message hit him like a physical blow. She was still living in the world they'd built together, still believing in the safety of their routines. Frank typed back, "Keep the schedule. Everything's going to be fine." The lie came easily. 7 years of practice in protective deception. But as his finger hovered over the send button, Frank thought about Sarah Martinez working late that night, probably sending her own reassuring messages to family, while she uncovered a conspiracy that would get her killed. How many people had died believing someone they loved was keeping them safe? He deleted the message and typed, "We need to talk when I get back. Important." Frank climbed out of the truck, the recording device heavy in his pocket. The stranger's voice echoed in his memory. These people don't just threaten, they follow through. But they'd already followed through. 7 years of exile. 7 years of watching Emma grow up in the shadow of his cowardice. 7 years of Vincent Torres haunting his dreams because Frank had been too blind to see what was happening in his own studio. The sheriff's office smelled like burnt coffee and the industrial disinfectant that seemed mandatory in all government buildings. Morrison looked up from his paperwork as Frank entered, and his expression immediately shifted from bureaucratic politeness to genuine concern. "Frank, you look like hell. What's wrong?" "Tom, I need to tell you something about who I was before Cedar Falls." Frank's voice cracked on the words. "About why I really came here." Morrison gestured to the chair across from his desk, but Frank remained standing. Sitting felt too much like surrendering, like accepting that his carefully constructed life was already over. "I know who you were," Morrison said quietly. "Frank Kellerman, late-night television. The Torres incident. I've known since you bought the radio station." Frank stared at him. "You knew?" "Small-town sheriff doesn't mean stupid sheriff. I ran a background check when you applied for your broadcast license. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Frank with the patience of a man who'd seen plenty of people running from their past. Question is, why are you telling me now? Frank pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he queued up the recording. Because someone just threatened Emma. And because I think Vincent Torres was murdered. For the next 30 minutes, Frank laid out everything. The recording, Sarah Martinez's death, Martin Blackstone's presence in the studio, the network money that had bought his silence. Morrison listened without interruption, taking notes in the careful shorthand Frank had seen him use at accident scenes and domestic disturbances. When Frank finished, Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at his notes as if they might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. Federal conspiracy, corporate murder, witness elimination, Morrison said finally. Frank, you understand what you're asking me to do? The kind of people you're talking about don't usually worry much about small-town sheriffs. I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm asking you to help me protect Emma while I figure out how to finish what Sarah Martinez started. Frank's phone buzzed again, another message from Emma about the station schedule, about their normal life that was already disappearing. Tom, these people killed a researcher because she found the truth. They'll kill a college freshman without blinking. Morrison stood up, walking to the window that overlooked Main Street. Frank could see the radio station from here, KCFL's modest antenna reaching toward clouds that promised afternoon rain. Emma was probably in there now, updating the playlist, answering phones, believing her father was just running errands around town. There's something else, Morrison said. Something I should have mentioned earlier. We've had some unusual activity lately. Out-of-state vehicles, people asking questions about you and Emma. I thought it was maybe reporters' anniversary coverage of the Torres thing. He turned back to Frank. But given what you just told me, I think we're past the point of coincidence. Frank's blood went cold. What kind of questions? Schedules, routines, where Emma goes to school, what time she gets home. Morrison's expression hardened. Frank, I think they've been planning this for weeks. Frank's knees nearly buckled. Weeks. While he'd been hosting drive-time shows and helping Emma with college applications, while they'd been living their carefully constructed normal life, predators had been circling, learning their patterns, preparing to strike. The coffee he'd drunk that morning rose in his throat like acid. Where is she now? Frank's voice came out as a whisper. At the station, far as I know. But Frank was already moving toward the door when his phone rang. Emma's ringtone, the theme from All the President's Men that she'd programmed as a joke about her journalism ambitions. His hands shook as he answered. Dad? Emma's voice was tight, controlled, but Frank could hear the fear underneath. There's someone here at the station. He says he's from Northwestern about my scholarship interview, but... She paused, and Frank heard a man's voice in the background, smooth and confident. Dad, something's wrong. Emma, listen to me very carefully, Frank said, gesturing frantically for Morrison to follow him. Is there more than one person? I can see 2 cars outside. The man inside is asking about you, about what you've told me about your television career. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Dad, he knows things. About Vincent Torres. About that night. Frank was running now, Morrison beside him, both of them heading for the patrol car. 7 years of protection, 7 years of distance from the truth, and it was all collapsing in real time. The predators hadn't just found them. They'd walked right into Emma's world, into the radio station that was supposed to be their sanctuary. Put me on speaker, Frank said as Morrison started the engine, sirens wailing. Emma, I'm coming, but I need you to do exactly what I say. The man's voice came through clearly now, cultured and patient. Miss Kellerman, your father has something that belongs to my employers. We'd very much like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. Frank felt rage explode in his chest, pure, cleansing fury that burned away 7 years of guilt and self-doubt. This was the same tone the network executives had used, the same corporate politeness that had convinced him to take their money and disappear. But Emma wasn't broken the way Frank had been. Emma was sharp, skeptical, trained by him to question everything. Emma, Frank said, his voice carrying across the speeding patrol car. "Tell him I'll trade myself for you. Tell him I'll come to the station alone, unarmed, with everything they want. But you walk out first." "Dad, no." "Tell him," Frank insisted, meeting Morrison's eyes. The sheriff nodded grimly, understanding the plan without words. "Tell him he has 10 minutes to decide." Emma's voice was steady when she spoke. "My father says he'll trade himself for me. You get what you want, I walk away. 10 minutes to decide." The man chuckled, and Frank recognized the sound, the same condescending amusement he'd heard from the stranger in the diner. "Miss Kellerman, I don't think you understand your situation. Your father has already made his choice. He's chosen to interfere with things far above his understanding." "No," Emma said, and Frank heard steel in her voice that reminded him of Sarah Martinez, of every journalist who'd ever refused to back down from the truth. "I don't think you understand your situation, because my father isn't the same man who ran away 7 years ago, and neither am I." Frank heard a click, then Emma's voice came through privately. "Dad, I triggered the emergency broadcast system. Everything that's happening in here is going out live on every radio in the county. Whatever they do to us, everyone will hear it." Pride and terror warred in Frank's chest. His daughter, his brilliant, fearless daughter, had just turned the radio station into a weapon, broadcasting the truth in real time, just like Sarah Martinez would have done, just like Vincent Torres had tried to do 7 years ago. "Emma, you beautiful, dangerous genius," Frank whispered. Morrison was already on his radio calling for backup for state police, for anyone who could reach the station before Frank's world exploded completely. But Frank knew they might be too late. The people who'd killed Sarah Martinez wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses, especially not witnesses broadcasting their crimes to half of Iowa. As they rounded the corner onto Main Street, Frank could see the radio station ahead. KCFL's modest building surrounded by black vehicles, men in expensive suits talking urgently into phones. The careful choreography of intimidation falling apart because they'd underestimated a small-town radio host and his journalism student daughter. Frank thought about Vincent Torres in those final moments, about the disappointment in his eyes. But Emma wasn't disappointed in her father. Emma was finishing what Frank should have started 7 years ago. The truth was finally fighting back. The emergency broadcast carried Emma's voice across 3 counties, her words cutting through morning radio shows and traffic reports like a blade through silk. Frank could hear her through the patrol car's radio as Morrison screeched to a halt behind the state police vehicles that had somehow arrived first. "My name is Emma Kellerman, and if something happens to my father and me in the next few minutes, you need to know why. 7 years ago, a man named Vincent Torres tried to tell the truth on live television. They killed him for it. They killed a researcher named Sarah Martinez for it. And now they're here in Cedar Falls because my father finally decided to stop running from it." Frank stepped out of the patrol car into chaos. FBI agents were setting up a perimeter, their radios crackling with commands and coordinates. The men in expensive suits were gone, fled or arrested, Frank couldn't tell which. Through the station's front window, he could see Emma at the broadcast desk, calmly reading from notes as if she were delivering the morning farm report. "The conspiracy involves Martin Blackstone, current nominee for Secretary of Defense, and a pattern of corporate murder disguised as accidents. My father has recordings, evidence, proof of everything they've tried to bury. Sarah Martinez died because she was alone. Vincent Torres died because he was silenced. But we're not alone, and we won't be silenced." FBI Special Agent Carol Vance approached Frank with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been briefed during the drive from Des Moines. "Mr. Kellerman, we need to talk. Your daughter's broadcast just became evidence in a federal investigation that's been ongoing for 6 months. Frank stared at her. 6 months? Sarah Martinez wasn't the only researcher who died. There've been 4 others over the past 3 years, all working on stories connected to Blackstone Industries. We've been trying to build a case, but we needed someone with direct knowledge of the conspiracy." Vance gestured toward the radio station where Emma's voice continued its steady recitation of truth. "Your daughter just handed us everything we needed." The absurdity hit Frank like a physical blow. 7 years of hiding, 7 years of convincing himself that silence was protection, and the FBI had been building their case anyway. Sarah Martinez's death hadn't been in vain. It had been the beginning of something larger, something that would have found Frank eventually whether he'd stayed hidden or not. "Is she safe?" Frank asked. "She's extraordinary," Vance said. "When we got the tip about unusual activity in Cedar Falls, we were expecting to find a victim. Instead, we found a journalist who turned her own kidnapping into a federal sting operation." Emma's voice carried across the street. Vincent Torres wasn't crazy. He wasn't having a breakdown. He was trying to warn America about a man who murders people for profit, who's about to be confirmed as our Secretary of Defense. My father was too scared to listen then. But he's listening now. We're all listening now. Frank walked toward the station, federal agents parting like water around him. Emma looked up as he entered, her eyes bright with tears and determination. She'd inherited his talent for broadcasting, but not his capacity for compromise. 7 years ago, Frank had taken the money because he thought it would protect her. Now Emma was protecting him, protecting the truth, protecting people she'd never met from a conspiracy that would have destroyed them all. "Dad," Emma said, pulling off her headphones as the FBI began documenting everything. "I'm sorry. I know you wanted to keep me safe, but you're exactly who I raised you to be," Frank said, pulling her into his arms. "You're exactly who Sarah Martinez was, who Vincent Torres was trying to be." 3 months later, Frank stood in the cemetery outside Cedar Falls, placing flowers on a grave that had been empty too long. The headstone read Vincent Torres, truth teller, the inscription Emma had chosen when they finally gave Vincent the burial he deserved. Martin Blackstone had withdrawn his nomination the day after Emma's broadcast. The FBI investigation had unraveled a conspiracy spanning decades, touching corporations and government agencies Frank had never imagined. 4 people were dead, but their deaths had meaning now. They'd become evidence instead of tragedies, justice instead of silence. KCFL still played afternoon drive time, but now it was Emma behind the microphone, her show broadcasting from Northwestern's journalism school via satellite. Frank listened every day from the small house he'd kept in Cedar Falls, the town that had sheltered him when he was running, and celebrated him when he finally stopped. Sometimes, late at night, Frank still heard Vincent Torres in his dreams. But the disappointment was gone from those eyes, replaced by something Frank had never expected to see again: pride. Not in the man Frank had been, but in the man Emma had helped him become. The truth, it turned out, was worth the wait.